Hello, this is Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives with another story about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. I'm your host, Dan Dyck. Regular listeners may have already heard our episode about Peter Dyck, who lived in the Carmen Hospital after a car crash left him unable to walk. Over the years, he had several automobiles made and modified so that he could drive around town and beyond. Our source for that episode was a story written by a man known as Big Bill. Today, we're going to tell you more about Big Bill. Our main sources of information on Big Bill's life are his own writings. In 2001, Edward Enns, a relative of Big Bill, compiled these writings and translated them to English. Big Bill was born Wilhelm Enns in 1894 in the village of Einlage in Imperial Russia. His family lived in poverty, and his father died when Bill was just 5 years old. Bill's mother left Russia, and the family arrived in Gretna, Manitoba in the spring of 1900. His mother remarried, and Bill grew up on his stepfather's farm at nearby Rosenfeld. In 1912, Bill married Katharina Nickel. They had 12 children over the next 2 decades. The family moved frequently, sometimes more than once in a year. Bill was a jack of all trades and worked a wide variety of jobs in different places. One of the family's longest stays was 7 years in Sexsmith, Alberta, where Bill was a miller and a trucker. In Manitoba, he worked as a teacher in Blumenort, a farm laborer in Gretna, a dragline operator in Rhineland, a medicine salesman in Altona, and a shoe repairman in Grunthal, among many other things. Although Bill and Katharina traveled around Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, they always came back to Altona. Between 1926 and 1950, Bill wrote many letters that were published in the Steinbach Post. Known by a few different names over the years, the Steinbach Post was a German-language periodical that ran from 1913 to 1971. German-speaking Mennonites in Canada, the United States, Paraguay, and Mexico were avid readers. In addition to world news, the Post printed a large number of letters from readers sharing local and personal news of each other's scattered families and friends. In its day, the letters section of the Post was kind of like Facebook is today. Bill wrote numerous short stories that were published in serial form. He also wrote a short autobiography that was published in the Post in 1928. In his earliest letters, Bill signed off as a reader, or with a combination of his initials. He began using Big Bill at the end of 1927, and after that, he almost always signed off as Big Bill, except for 1933, when he inexplicably signed several letters as Little Wilhelm. Bill didn't write on any sort of consistent schedule. Sometimes he wrote multiple letters a month, and other times went months without writing, but he wrote in from wherever he was living. He reported solemnly on local tragedies and crimes. He announced illnesses, deaths, and marriages. He wrote commentary on the weather, local events, and occasionally politics. He reached out to friends and acquaintances whose addresses he didn't have and asked for news from them in return. He also told humorous, wildly exaggerated stories about silly situations he had gotten himself into, often poking fun at himself or his wife. It's hard to paraphrase Bill's stories without compromising his sense of humor. Here's an example of his playful reporting on local events. This excerpt is from a letter dated February 15, 1928, from Deloraine, Manitoba. I read in the Post of February 8th of a fight that had taken place in Altona. What people don't do when one is not present. The strangest part of the story is that there was no victor, which means that they must both have had the same teacher. We also catch glimpses of larger developments through Big Bill's reports. In the late 1920s, there was a small movement of Mennonites from Manitoba and Saskatchewan to the Peace River region of northern Alberta. Bill announces some of the families departing, but he repeatedly expresses his own disinterest in moving there. The winters are too long, too cold, and too dark. But in 1930, Bill changed his tune, and the family moved to Peace River. They settled in Sexsmith and stayed for 7 years, the longest they stayed in any one place, aside from Altona. Bill complained frequently about the winters in Sexsmith. In a letter dated February 20th, 1935, he writes with characteristic humor, "Lord Winter has really come again this year. We thought he might skip over this time, but he has brought his cousin Frost along, and since his cousin likes it over here, they have decided to stay for a while. Since his sisters and nieces, Wind, have quite a good reputation in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, he brought none of them along. He is not sorry about that, since he knows they are hated by women over here. Women have also shown anger towards him by now." When Bill and his family made it back to Altona, he continued to report on the weather. This excerpt is from a letter dated February 7th, 1938. "It is cold now, or at least we think it is, but someone was not cold enough, or he wanted to know for sure how cold it was. He took the old Mrs. Anton Hepner's thermometer. He possibly thought the old lady didn't care about the temperature anymore, but she would like to know what the temperature is. She believes that he will return it for summer, and she is looking forward to that, for she goes outside much more in the summer." Bill often wrote silly stories about his wife Katharina, who he usually referred to as his Olsha, or Old One. In his stories, Katharina becomes a larger-than-life character, a strict but eccentric authority figure. At her direction, Bill does all manner of absurd things. Here's a story about his Olsha in a letter dated December 19th, 1934, from Sexsmith. "My Olsha has shadowy sides as well as bright ones. She is very strange at times. Recently, the children got a puppy. Since he did not know the rules, he wanted to go outside at any time, and since it was something new for the children who did not know a dog, the Olsha had to stand at the door most of the time, letting the dog in and out. She got so frustrated that she ordered me to install the door on the other side of the house. 'What is that supposed to mean?' I asked. She replied very harshly, 'I've just let the dog out again, and if you quickly install the door on the other side, he won't find his way there and will stay outside.' We fooled the dog, and he is still outside." In other letters, Bill humorously describes fleeing Katharina's wrath after causing unfortunate mishaps. In this letter, dated August 17, 1933, Bill reports on her reaction to a surprise visit from some of their friends. "This was too much for her, and she fainted. Now what? 'Water, water!' somebody yelled, and I ran into the front room to get some. But I was careless in grabbing the first container. I ran out and poured it over Olsha's face. But I had not looked into the container, and so instead of a pail of water, it was a pail of curds and whey. It helped, for in a moment she was on her feet, but she looked terrible. I wasted no time in running around the corner and then around the next corner, for I had to get ready hastily for, well, you know what. I jumped into a window, and since she still had the sour milk in her eyes, she did not see me." On at least 2 occasions, we get a glimpse of their relationship from Katharina's perspective when she wrote in to the Steinbach Post. It's clear that she shared Bill's sense of humor and was just as capable of teasing him. In a letter from Sexsmith, Alberta, dated March 2nd, 1933, she writes, "Dear readers, I must also take a turn in writing to the Post. Big Bill always writes, but this time he's out of luck. I want to correct the impression that Big Bill is a coward by the way he writes, and he also portrays me as very strict. I don't know what you call it when, for instance, he combs the hair of a big polar bear, or snips off a few hairs from the forehead of an angry bull moose. Recently, he spit a wild cat in the face. Can he still then be considered a coward? But I am happy to have him trained that he ducks when I look at him. But he does much business that is convenient to me. When I say the boss needs a few pennies, he gives me everything he has. That's Big Bill." Katharina goes on to tell a story about Bill bringing her wool for spinning, except that it's still attached to the sheep. Bill and the children attempt to shear the sheep, but the wool is full of wood ticks, and the shears jam up immediately. Katharina's story ends up with the sheep wandering away from the house with all of its wool, and the shears stuck to it, while Bill searches for something to get rid of the wood ticks. She signs off as the Ulsha. Because of Bill's tendency to embellish situations, it can be difficult to know how much truth there is to his stories. He wrote quite seriously and in detail about local tragedies like fires, murders, and accidents. But stories about his personal life tend towards the humorous, spirited adventures of him and his Ulsha. Some personal incidents, though, were repeatedly referenced by Bill years after he first shared them. In the spring of 1930, Bill and Katharina set out from Altona, heading towards Alberta. On the way, Bill reported he stopped and pulled out his new second-hand rifle, hoping to hunt a goose. In his letter from Alberta, dated June 4, 1930, Bill writes, "Far and near, nothing living was visible except those geese. I aimed, fired, but no goose. But then a man in full gallop came towards us, and it was a mounted police. Oh, if only I had thrown the rifle in the river at Schontal and had made myself a slingshot out of an old inner tube. I would still not have hit anything, and the Mountie would have been polite." According to Bill, the Mountie then took him to the court in Boissevain, where the judge fined him $20.80. Bill further embarrassed himself by handing over his tobacco pouch instead of his wallet to pay the fine. The failed goose incident was so memorable to Bill that he referenced it numerous times over the years, sometimes comparing it to his latest blunders. Katharina teased him about it too. In a letter dated September 2, 1937 from Altona, that's 7 years after the goose incident, Bill reminisces on 25 years of marriage with his Ulsha. He writes, "Her hair is quite grey by now. I wanted to know how that had happened. Because, she said, the boss must be identifiable in some way. I was glad that I had kept myself well, but she turned to me and said suddenly, 'You are lucky. You have always had white hair.' And looking at me sarcastically, she whispered in my ear, 'But that time when you had to pay $20 for that goose, your hair became whiter.'" Bill stopped writing to the Steinbeck Post around 1950 after a run of almost 25 years. By then, he and Katharina were living in Rosenfeld, but they continued to move frequently. In the 1950s, they lived in Ontario, Altona, Winnipeg, Ely, Winnipeg again, and then again in Altona. Bill passed away in 1957 at the age of 64. His Ulsha, Katharina, died in 1972. The MHA holds a collection of Big Bill's letters and stories, as well as archived copies of the Steinbeck Post. To see images related to this episode, or to hear this episode again, go to mharchives.ca. If you have questions or comments about this program, email us at info@mharchives.ca.
I'm archivist Conrad Stace. This program is made possible through support from Golden West Radio and listeners like you. If you want to support this program and the work of the archives, you can find out how to do that on our website at mharchives.ca and click on support.
Thanks to Kaylee Dyck for researching and writing this episode. Thanks also to the Tales team of archivist and advisor Conrad Stace and Graham Unruh, who helps the program reach online listeners wherever they are. Join me again next week for the story of Johannes Clausen, a young man who firmly stood with his conscience and refused to go to war in 1917. He paid for that decision with his life. I'm your host, Dan Dyck. Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives will be back next week with more stories about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. Thanks for listening.